She thought she escaped her past, until her husband opened a letter meant to stay hidden. She had been careful for 3 years. 3 years of quiet mornings and steady routines, and a life built so deliberately, so thoughtfully, so brick by careful brick, that sometimes she would stand at her kitchen window and watch the light come across the open fields and almost believe it. Almost believe that she was just who she appeared to be. A rancher's wife in a small Texas town. A woman with flour on her apron, and a garden that needed tending, and a husband who came in every evening smelling of horses and hard work. Almost. But the thing about a past you are running from is that it does not run. It waits. It sits wherever you left it, patient and perfectly still, and it lets you build your new life and settle into it and start to breathe again. And then, when you have finally exhaled completely, when your guard is down and your heart is open and you have more to lose than you have ever had before, it moves. It moves in the form of a letter, a plain envelope. Her name written in handwriting she had not seen in 3 years, but recognized the way you recognize the smell of something that once frightened you. Instantly, in your bones, before your mind has even caught up. She had picked up the mail herself that morning, because Hope was out in the south field, and she liked walking to the post box in the early cool. She had sorted through the envelopes without thinking, the feed bill, a notice from the county, a letter from Holt's sister in Arkansas, and then that one. She had stood in the road and looked at it for a long time. Then she had put it at the bottom of the pile and walked back to the house and set all the mail on the kitchen table. She told herself she would deal with it. She told herself she would find a way. But by the time she had made it back to the stove, she heard the door. Holt had come in early. A fence had been finished ahead of schedule. He was in a good mood, warm and easy, the way he was when work went well, and he came into the kitchen and kissed her on the side of the head and picked up the mail from the table. She stood with her back to him and her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and she listened to the sound of envelopes being opened and hoped. She heard him stop. She knew, without turning around, which letter he had reached. If you have ever had a secret you carried for so long it became part of the weight of you, part of the way you moved through the world, and then watched it surface in the one place you most needed it to stay hidden, you already understand what Eleanor felt in that moment. You already know that particular stillness, the way the whole world seemed to contract down to one small point of terrible quiet. Stay with this, because what happens next is not simple, and the love in the story is real precisely because it is not simple. Her name was Eleanor Voss, or rather, that was the name she had been born with, the name she had grown up with in a small town in Kentucky, the name that was attached to a story she had spent 3 years trying to outrun. Now she was Eleanor Marsh, wife of Holt Marsh, a woman with a herb garden and 2 barn cats and a husband who had never once given her reason to doubt him. She turned around. Holt was standing at the table with the letter in his hand. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that people called plain and Eleanor had always called honest. It was a face that showed exactly what was in it. No performance. No adjustment for audience. Whatever Holt Marsh felt, you could find in his face if you knew where to look. Right now it showed confusion. And underneath the confusion, the early edge of something she had dreaded for 3 years. He looked up at her. He said her name. Just that. Just Eleanor. But the way he said it asked 100 questions. She set down her coffee cup. She pulled out a chair and she sat down. She folded her hands on the table. And she told him everything. It took a long time. The coffee went cold. The morning light shifted from pale gold to full white while she talked. She did not hurry any of it, and she did not spare herself any of it. She told it straight, the way she had always believed things ought to be told but had been too afraid to tell. Before Holt, before Texas, before she had rebuilt herself into a woman she was not ashamed to be, there had been another life. She had been married before, not to a kind man. His name was Robert Greer, and she had been 22 when she married him and 24 when she understood, fully and without any room left for hoping otherwise, that she had made a terrible mistake. Robert Greer was not a violent man in the way people meant when they used that word. He did not leave marks. He was clever enough to know that marks were evidence. What he did instead was quieter and in some ways more thorough. He took things from her slowly. Her friends, First, by making every friendship inconvenient or complicated until she gave him up to keep the peace. Then her family, by manufacturing disagreements and misunderstandings until the distance between Eleanor and the people who loved her was so wide it felt unbridgeable. Then her sense of her own mind, by questioning every thought she had and every decision she made and every perception she trusted until she barely knew what was real. By the time she was 26, Eleanor Greer was completely alone. She had a husband who controlled every dollar that came into the house and monitored every conversation she had and told her regularly, in calm, reasonable tones, that she was lucky to have someone patient enough to manage her the way she needed managing. She had believed him. That was the hardest part to tell. She looked at Holt across the table, and she told him that she had believed it, that she had sat in that house in Kentucky and thought that this was simply what her life was and would remain, and that she had earned it somehow. It was a small thing that broke her free, smaller than you would expect for something that changed everything. It was a letter from her younger sister, Ruth. Somehow it had gotten past Robert's careful management of the mail. She never knew how. A short letter, just a few lines. Ruth said she missed her. Ruth said she was worried. Ruth said that whoever Eleanor had become, whatever she believed about herself, Ruth remembered who she was before all of it, and that person was worth knowing. Eleanor had read that letter in the pantry, with the door closed, standing among the flour sacks and the canned goods, and she had cried harder than she had cried in years, not from sadness, from recognition, from a sudden sharp pain of being seen by someone who loved her, after so long of being told she was not worth seeing. It took her 8 more months to leave. She planned it the way you plan something, when you cannot afford a single mistake. She saved money in the only ways available to her, a little at a time, hidden in places Robert would never look. She wrote to Ruth in secret. She arranged everything she could arrange in advance. And then one morning in March, while Robert was in town, she packed one bag and she left. She did not go to Ruth. She could not. Robert would have found her there within the day. She went west instead. She kept moving. She changed her name back to Voss. She stopped in 3 different towns before she reached Cutter's Bend, Texas, and found work at a boarding house run by a widow named Frances, who asked no questions and paid fairly and let Eleanor sleep in a small clean room at the back of the house where she slowly, painstakingly, quietly began to find herself again. She met Holt 2 years after that, at a church social she had almost not attended because she was still in a habit of making herself small and invisible in public places. He had sat down next to her on a bench outside and said that he had noticed she was the only other person at the whole gathering who looked like they would rather be reading, and asked if she liked books. She had laughed. She had not expected to laugh. They talked for 2 hours. He walked her back to Frances's boarding house. He came back the next Saturday with a book he thought she might like. He was not showy about his interest in her. He did not perform. He just kept showing up, steady and consistent and unhurried, until one day she realized she had started to look forward to his arrival in a way that was warm and unafraid. She had told herself, when she agreed to marry him, that she would tell him eventually, when the time was right, when she was sure enough of him and of herself to say it all. But time had a way of moving, and certainty had a way of staying just out of reach. And 3 years had passed, and she had never told him, and she had buried the thing so deep in her daily life that she had almost convinced herself it was not there, until this morning. She finished talking, and the kitchen was very quiet. Holt had not moved from his place across the table. He had listened to all of it without speaking. His face had moved through things as she talked. She had watched it, afraid of what she would see. She had prepared herself for anger. She had prepared herself for the cold withdrawal that comes when trust is broken. She had not prepared herself for what she actually saw. When she finally stopped, when she had said the last of it and sat with her hands still folded and her eyes on the table, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked her one question. He asked if she was safe. Right now, today, was she safe? She looked up. He was leaning forward slightly, and his gray eyes were direct and serious, and what was in them was not anger. It was concern, the concentrated, specific concern of a man trying to understand the shape of a threat, so he could put himself between it and the person he loved. She said she did not know. She said the letter was from Robert, that he had found out where she was. She did not know how. She said the letter said he wanted to talk. that it was reasonable and calm and written in exactly the tone he always used that made everything sound measured, while underneath it was a warning dressed up as a conversation. Holt looked at the letter in his hand. He read it again. She watched him reading it and saw the moment he understood the language inside it, the particular texture of a threat that wore the clothes of reasonableness. He set the letter down on the table with a kind of deliberate care that meant he was managing something inside himself. He said her name again, Eleanor, but differently this time, not as a question. He said that he wished she had told him sooner, not as an accusation, just as a statement of a true thing. She said she knew. She said she was sorry. He said that she never had protected him from her history, that his job was not to be protected from the hard parts of the person he married. His job was to be present for them. She pressed her lips together. He said that Robert Greer was not going to come to his property and have a conversation with his wife. Not today, not any day. She said she did not want Holt to carry this, that it was her trouble, and she had never wanted it to become his. He looked at her steadily and said that she became his when she married him. All of her, every part, including the parts she had been afraid to show him, and that he was not interested in only the easy version of Eleanor. He had married the whole woman, and he intended to honor that. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said that she had spent several years learning how to not need anyone, that she had gotten very good at it, that it was a hard habit to set down. He said he had noticed. He said he'd been patient about it, because he understood that some things could not be rushed. But he said that she was allowed to let him in now, that it was safe. That word, safe, she had not used it about a person in a very long time. She nodded, small and careful, but real. Holt went into town that afternoon. He went to see the sheriff, a steady man named Briggs who had known Holt's father and who took things seriously when Holt brought them to him. He brought the letter. He explained the situation plainly. He asked what legal standing Robert Greer had in the state of Texas regarding a wife who had left the marriage and rebuilt elsewhere. Briggs looked into it. What came back was more useful than Eleanor had dared hope. Robert Greer had never filed for divorce. In his mind, apparently, the marriage was still intact, which meant, under the laws of the state and the circumstances, that Eleanor's subsequent marriage to Holt existed in a complicated legal space that needed untangling. But it also meant that Robert Greer had no clean legal ground to stand on when he showed up in Texas making claims, especially given what Eleanor was prepared to state on record about the nature of those years in Kentucky. Briggs said he would make some inquiries. He had contacts in Kentucky through a fellow sheriff's network. He said Holt should bring Eleanor in to make a statement. Eleanor had not expected to be asked to speak for herself in an official capacity. She had spent so many years keeping everything quiet that the idea of putting it on record, saying out loud in front of lawmen, and watching it be written down, made her hands tremble slightly when she thought about it. But she went. She sat across from Sheriff Briggs, and she told it straight, the same way she had told Holt that morning. Briggs listened carefully and wrote carefully and treated her with a plain, uncomplicated respect that she had not always expected from men in positions of authority. When she finished, he said that she had handled herself with more sense than most people in her situation would have managed. It was a small thing to say, but she felt it. Robert Greer arrived in Cutter's Bend 11 days later. Eleanor knew before she saw him. She felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive, a tightening in the chest, an old familiar watchfulness coming back into her body, like a language she had once been forced to learn. He was standing outside the general store when she and Holt came into town for supplies. He looked exactly as she remembered, neat and composed and wearing that particular expression of patient reasonableness that she had once found so disorienting. He saw her and he smiled. Holt felt her hand tighten on his arm. He looked down at her face and then across the street and understood immediately. He did not move toward Robert. He did not raise his voice or make a scene. He simply stood where he was, steady and present, and looked at Robert Greer with the calm, unimpressed eyes of a man who was not remotely afraid and was not going to be moved. Robert approached them. He said Eleanor's name, her old name, Eleanor Greer, and she felt the name like a hand reaching for something that no longer belonged to it. Holt said, quietly and without particular heat, that her name was Eleanor Marsh. and that Robert was welcome to speak with Sheriff Briggs if he had legal business in Cutter's Bend. Robert looked at Holt for a moment with the measuring look of a man trying to assess what he was dealing with. Whatever he saw in Holt's face apparently told him something, because the composure shifted slightly. Just slightly. He said he only wanted to talk to Eleanor, that they had unfinished matters. Holt said that all matters between Robert and Eleanor had been finished 3 years ago, when Eleanor had walked out of a situation that no decent man would have put his wife in. He said it without anger and without theater, just as a plain statement of fact. Briggs appeared from across the street. He had been watching. He had apparently expected this day. He said that Robert Greer had been served notice through his counterpart in Kentucky that any harassment of Eleanor Marsh in the state of Texas would be dealt with under the relevant statutes. He asked Robert if he understood. Robert stood for a moment in the middle of the street with his reasonable composure and his patient expression, and nowhere to put either of them. Then he left. He did not come back. The legal matters took several more months to resolve properly, but they resolved. The original marriage was officially dissolved. Eleanor's marriage to Holt was fully and properly documented. Every piece of paper that needed to be in order was put in order. On the day the last document came back, Holt set it on the kitchen table in front of her without ceremony. She looked at it for a long moment. The formal language at the bottom, the signatures, the seal. She pressed her hand flat against it. Then she let out a breath that felt like it had been living inside her for 3 years. Holt was leaning in the kitchen doorway, watching her. When she looked up, he said nothing. He just crossed the kitchen and pulled her in and held on. Not dramatically, just solidly, the way he did everything. She let herself be held. She let herself be held without calculating what it would cost her or preparing for the moment it would be taken away. She just stood in the kitchen of the home she had built and let the arms of the man who had chosen her, all of her, hold her in the morning light. And it was enough. It was more than enough. The garden grew well that summer, better than any year before. Eleanor added a row of lavender along the near fence that she had been meaning to plant for 2 years, but had kept putting off. The way you put off things that feel too permanent, when some part of you is still not sure you are allowed to stay. She planted it on a Wednesday morning, while Holt was fixing the barn roof. He came down at midday and stood looking at the new row and said it was a good choice. She said she thought so, too. He went back up to the roof. She stayed in the garden a while longer, on her knees in the warm dirt, pressing roots into the earth with the quiet certainty of someone who has finally, completely decided to be somewhere. Some stories are about finding love. This one is also about finding yourself, about what it takes to trust again after trust has been used against you, about the specific courage it requires to let someone see the parts of you that you have learned to hide. Eleanor had spent 3 years being careful, and there is nothing wrong with careful. Careful kept her alive and moving and functional when she had very little else. But careful was supposed to be a bridge, not a destination. Holt Marsh had been patient enough to wait for her to cross it, and she had. If this story stayed with you tonight, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me which moment in the story felt the most real to you. Tell me where you are watching from right now. Whether you are somewhere quiet and far away or right in the middle of your ordinary evening, your presence here means something. Subscribe so these stories find you every time. There's always another one waiting. And every single one is made with you in mind.